Hello and welcome to Outlaw Bookseller with me, Steve Nee Andrews, writer, bookseller, collector. And today we're falling into the YouTube cliche of the TBR, the to be read. As a professional bookseller and sometime writer, I do find all these little booktube bits of nomenclature and terminology rather amusing. I'm getting used to them now. And my God, I'm even adopting some. It's scary, isn't it? I used to say my unread pile, but TBR. Now everybody knows a TBR now. So we're going to do a TBR today, which I don't normally do, because of course that way lies madness. Because of course I must have 200 books I haven't read easily. And of course, since I've been doing YouTube and doing more book hauls, as I build up my nostalgia collecting of the old A format Skiffy paperback. Skiffy is okay, sci-fi isn't, SF is preferred. Speculative fiction we'll talk about another time, we have misses of that. Science fiction is what it is really. But, you know, without digressing further into that bit of terminology, yeah, we just end up with loads and loads of stuff. And, you know, I was going to do a video at some point about, you know, why you shouldn't do too many book hauls. And it's probably the simple answer is you run out of money and space. Or you run out of money even if you've got loads of space. So it is what it is. Anyway, a TBR today. I've said a number of times on the channel, and I'm wearing these again because it's a really beautiful day, and as I've said many times, opposite where I shoot here in the hideout. And I know I'm shooting here a lot. I used to move around the house more, and I hope to get back to that at some point, because I do like to have different backgrounds and what have you, but I know you like to see the books. There's a window in front of me, and I get terrible glare, but it's a beautiful day today. It's sunny. It's sort of mid-October. And, you know, it seems a shame to waste it. And, of course, you know, when it's getting old, you know, I don't have crow's feet. I have raven's claws, of course, which is much, much better. But I'm going to take these off because I can't see a thing. But and the glare's not too bad. So if I squint, forgive me. Anyway, what is this TBR about? I've said on the channel a number of times that the 1990s was a time when I stepped back from reading a lot of SF. And at that stage, I read a lot about SF. This started about 1993, and I did a piece for a fanzine which was never published. It was the third issue of Bath SF fanzine, which was called The Death of SF. And I felt certain by that point that really science fiction had been in decline for a few years and didn't really have anything new to say, and it was just treading old ground. And even though I kept up with my favourite writers, there were lots of things which came along, particularly from American writers, which I didn't read. And I find now, looking back, that the 90s was the period which my knowledge really isn't as great as it is for other decades. And I sort of decided to do an objective measure of this by looking through this great book, which I've had for many years, Science Fiction, the 101 Best Books, 1980 Best Novels, I should say, 1985 to 2010, by the very wonderful Damien Broderick and Paul DeFilippo. And Paul is a contributor occasionally to Deep Ends, the ballad anthology like me, and we never met, we're friendly online, and what a great guy he is. Hi Paul, very good writer, quirky, interesting, funny, and an irreverent chap, a bit like me really in that respect. So this, as I have shown this before I think, but what I would say is, and I've said this many times as well, is that good core reference books written by writers and critics who know this stuff are far better than anything you'll get on the internet. You get a lot of opinion and what have you. But of course the thing with the internet is, I mean, you look at BookTube itself, there's loads of people out there who are, you know, quite young or inexperienced readers. No problem with that. I was a young inexperienced reader at one point, but you have lots of fire when you're that age, and they're making these pronouncements about things based on what, you know, and they're not all like that. Some of them have done the background reading. Context and history, as I say, are everything for appreciating any form of literature. You know, you do have to have a context, otherwise it's just like sort of a cork tossed in the ocean, you know, and you can't really tell if it's afloat just through luck or where it ends up or what have you. So looking at this, what I decided to do, I was looking at the other night, and I've read it many times, and it's a great book, and just decided to look through, because it covers 85 to 2010. It was published about 2012, I think. I decided to sort of do a measure, and it's not proportional, obviously, because 85 to 90 is only 5 years. There are fewer books in that period and so on. And I decided to look at the 90s, and I think altogether there's about 40 books from the 90s in here. And I worked out I'd read about 13 of them. And, you know, it is about quality, and at the same time, I do like to sort of know my stuff, and have read sort of a lot of the sort of minor authors or authors that maybe don't float my boat. It's good to have some knowledge of them, and I am kind of in that phase of my reading again, but largely because of the channel, because I do so much SF, and the SF content is popular. So it's important for me to put my understanding in context as well by looking at areas I haven't sort of paid as much attention to. And the way I used to keep up in the 90s, I would read anthologies and I would read my favourites. I stuck with certain authors who were still around and working then: J.G. Ballard, Christopher Priest, M. John Harrison, William Gibson, several others. These are people whose books I bought and buy automatically. And of course there were generations of writers who passed on. But looking really through this, I mean, the late 80s was a fantastic time in SF, particularly in the States, and early and mid 80s in the UK was great as well. But the 90s seemed to me to sort of lose things. And looking at what we have here, seeing what pops up in here, a lot of the sort of books in this, I've read the writers, but not essentially the selected books. Like, for example, it mentions Sinners by Pat Cadigan, which I think I've read that one. I've certainly read Fools. And there's Sarah Canary, which by Karen Joy Fell, which I read when it came out, Henry Holt hardcover, don't have it anymore. There's a Paul Macaulay, I've not read that one. Stations of the Tide by Michael Swanwick, which is in my book 100 Must Read Science Fiction Novels, even though I don't have a copy. There's people like Stephen Baxter, who I've read. China Mountain Zhang by Maureen F. McHugh, which is a fantastic book. That's in my book as well. Red Mars by Kim Stanley Robinson. There's things like Fire on the Deep. There's books like Michael Moorcock's Blood, which I've read, Diamond Age by Neil Stevenson, Night Lamp by Jack Vance. But mostly a lot of the 90s stuff I found I hadn't read. When we get to the noughties, or whatever you want to call that decade, I found that I'd read a lot more, and that's a strange thing. That's because my friend Simon Hemmings, who occasionally has some music on the channel, he lives in Colorado. Hi Simon, hope you're watching, hope you're well. He and I, we go sort of years without seeing each other now because he's in the States, and he worked with me for about 5 years in the early part of the century. And when Simon came on board in the bookshop I was running as manager, he was just getting into SF, and we talked about it a lot. And also on our team then was James Reich, the writer who lives in Albuquerque in New Mexico, who's written a science fiction novel, several other novels. He's got a new SF novel coming out. Hi James. And James has sort of done introductions to sort of books by Barry Malzberg and what have you. And he's had acclaim from Malzberg and Moorcock. So this was part of my little crew that we had in the early 90s. And that got me sort of re-engaged really after a period where I just stuck to the stuff I liked. I'd stuck to the criticism and the history and thinking conceptually about it, and just reading the odd anthology. And of course at that time it was the time when I got signed up to do 100 Must Read Science Fiction Novels. So there you go. So after a lengthy preamble, what I decided to do is to show you some of the books which I'm going to read. I'm finding that at the moment, because my reading's very scattershot because of the channel and I'm reading the odd new thing, I've decided to try and put a bit more structure on it. And there's a Jack Vance video coming up, which you probably will have seen by the time this comes up. It depends on the editing. So I do like to do this sort of time paradox thing, as you know. And I've been reading Jack Vance's Demon Princess series. So there's a deadline to that. I've got 2 books left to read, and I've got about 3 days left to read them in before I shoot something about them. So I'm sort of setting myself a deadline, but I'm not setting myself a deadline for this TBR. I'll probably say about 3 months, because I want to read some contemporary books as well. But I'm doing a 90s SF TBR, and when I've read these books, or at least some of them, I will report back and let you know what I think. So we're going to move through them one by one, and I'm just going to move this a second because I'm going to get the B format books out of the way first of all. This is something new which has just been reissued, and this is Growing Out Weightless by John M. Ford, which has just come out in Gollancz Masterworks. John M. Ford had a reasonably glittering career, lots of acclaim. I don't think he was ever a bestseller as such. I think the closest he came to being a bestseller was The Dragon Waiting, which is a kind of historical fantasy novel, which I think I've shown you again recently. And I don't actually remember this one, but it's a good title. And he died, how old was he? Let's see. on the fingers. He was only in his late 40s, maybe 50, so he died quite young, and he's very involved with fandom as well. And this is sort of a coming of age story, sort of set on the moon, and it's quite nice to see this going into Masterworks, because what's interesting, when you look at Masterworks from the 90s on, there are a lot more female writers, which is really, really good. But you are seeing, you know, there's a certain names haven't popped up yet, and whether this should be in Masterworks, I will tell you when I've read it. On that front, and also on the front of female writers, something I've meant to read for years, and this is the first in a trilogy, is Gwyneth Jones's White Queen. This was reissued in Masterworks about a year and a half ago, and they've done quite a lot of Jones. They've done about 4 of them, and this is the first of 3. And for me, on her, the jury is out. I have read Kairos, and I'm not certain about that, so I'm going to give this one a go. I was thinking of buying a nice little lay format copy from my friend Graham, because I know he's got one spare, because he's got hardcover first of all these, but he seems to be sort of hanging on to his stuff these days, which is a result of watching this channel and, you know, redeveloping that amazing A format fetish that we all have if you're above a certain age. So yeah, so this is an interesting one. She's got a long career as well, set in 2038, the world ravaged by sort of all sorts of geological problems, volcanoes, earthquakes, what have you, and aliens arrive amidst political turmoil, and there are 3 of these, as I say, so that's one of them there as well. So there's a couple of the B formats I'm going to get into, and while we sort of move forward and have a look at the A's, I'm just going to slip this nice copy of Mike Resnick's 7 Views of Olduvai Gorge in there, which I acquired the other day, because Matt Defoe at Science Fiction Reads. Hi Matt, over there in Canada. What a great guy he is, with those baby blue eyes and those wonderful book hauls he does. He's such a nice chap. He sort of talked about Mike Resnick, and he's shown a couple of times a book called Birthright, which I'd love to read, but it's really, really hard to get over here. And Resnick is somebody I've read short stories by, but never sort of dipped my toe into the novels, and I'm going to do that soon. So this is a little chat book, because this was a Nebula ordering story, and I love short stories, and it's from phoenixpick.com. And even though I would prefer to have, you know, a little A format book, for a slim novella, this is really, really handy for shelving purposes. Now, Olduvai Gorge, of course, was one of the preeminent, and it still is, one of the preeminent locations for human evolution discoveries of fossils. And I think back in the 50s and 60s, the famous anthropological paleontological family, the Leakeys, made all sorts of discoveries there, you know, and they sort of found all sorts of sort of proto-humans and what have you. And this is about aliens coming to Earth in the future and looking at man throughout the ages, and man is extinct. So that's going to be really great. So I'm looking forward to that. And, you know, good, strong concept. That's what we need. So I'm going to leave that there for a little while and maybe show you some of the 90s stuff. I'm going to go roughly chronological. There is other stuff besides this. But there are quite a lot I want to get through. There's a little review copy slip from Grafton Books, or something from the 80s, and I've got some 80s books here in the background. When I've done some 90s stuff, I'm going to do some reading and rereading of 80s stuff I missed at the time, because there was so much, you know, and I was reading lots of general fiction and crime as well, and so you couldn't keep up with everything. So what have we got? Mike Resnick. This is Second Contact. We love that title, and I decided to give that a try. I'm trying to pick up his books as I come across them and give him a go, and they always to me look very straight ahead, but the short stories I remember reading were very good. They were in a collection that he and Barry Milesberg put together. They both contributed to it. Not really an anthology, because they're the only contributors, so because they were chums and things, which is important. So Second Contact, and this is a murder story. So whether this is going to sort of tick my boxes in terms of conceptual breakthrough and stuff, we'll see, but we'll have a go at that. Second Contact, great title, really good. I like that sort of thing where there's an established usage or cliche and somebody augments it, like for example, you know, Robert Heinlein's Sixth Column. I mean, it's clever stuff, you know, you've got to get to it before anybody else does. That's the trouble, and most of those sort of things people have got to a long time ago. Anyway, somebody that, again, my friend Graham has been nagging me to read, and he taught me to buying this book a while ago, and I'm not read it yet, and he also sold me the sequel as well, is Judith Moffat, The Ragged World, and there we go. And these had loads of critical acclaim, nice as you see, and it's Del Rey, which is really, really nice, and apparently these are really good. New York Times notable book, which you don't get a lot of SF that way. And, you know, the Los Angeles Times said it was good, winner of the John W. Campbell Award. And this is early 21st century ecological destruction. And again, it's aliens coming along to save the human race. So, you know, these are traditional SF themes. So we shall see. So that's going to go. And it's nice and slim as well. Something that puts me off increasingly as the years go on is that books get longer and longer. Now, of course, there are still some short books and there have always been some long books. But the fact is this, is publishing changed after the 60s in terms of the size of bestsellers. And this is actually down to SF and fantasy, and I may have said this on the channel before. In the 1960s, Dune was a huge bestseller, and of course Dune is a massive book. And of course, Lord of the Rings finally became a bestseller in the USA. There was the pirated Ace edition, tied in with the counterculture. Also, we had Stranger in a Strange Land, another big book by Heinlein. Of course, he did lots of big books after that. Before that, they'd been fairly short and modest because they were from the age of the magazines. Paperbacks really sort of kicked in a very, very big sense around about 1960. And Robert Silverberg writes about the collapse of the magazine markets in some of his autobiographical work, which I will touch on again when I do a Silverberg update, which is coming because I've been reading some more Silverberg recently, filling in some gaps of early things I hadn't covered. So I'm going to do an early Silverberg video at some point, just to look at, you know, for you to pick out the best things from that period before he moves into high gear in the late 60s and early 70s. So yeah, so those big books were successful. You also had things like the Arthur Haley novels like Airport, what have you. And publishers developed this idea that what people wanted was quantity over quality. And unfortunately, that's grown and grown and grown. And even and it sort of makes me groan as well, because you get a lot of novels now, and this has been going on for at least 20 years. You see that novels, even mainstream novels, get bigger and bigger and bigger. And the average sort of length for a novel now is about 300, 350 pages. And for most novels of any kind, it's just way too long. There isn't the conception there. They're padded out. I remember a novel written by somebody I worked with about 10 years ago who she used to write really well. She was a great writer, and she studied it, and she lives in Scotland now, I believe. I haven't seen her for a very long time. And she wrote a book, and some of it came about when she was studying creative writing, and it was really good. The best part of it, though, was a secondary thread about a peripheral character, and that peripheral character and that secondary thread was better than the rest of the book. The problem was that it was actually just padding. It didn't actually add anything to the main thrust of the narrative. If she'd taken that character and that approach out and made it into a short story, it'd been brilliant. So the book was too long and it just didn't work. So, and that's my main problem now. I don't want more of the same. I want something that keeps me fresh and alert and stimulating. The novel, of course, comes from novelty. Oh, that's novel, the 3-volume novel. But if a novel doesn't have novelty, it kind of ceases to be a novel. And I'm a firm believer in that, which is why I like genre fiction, because of its energy and rawness. Something I've shown you before briefly is John Gribbin's Inner Visions, which I'm going to give over. Then most of these are American books. This is British, of course. This is a scientist, so that's going to be something. Something I've had for ages. And again, I bought this on my mate Graham. I bought this about like 3 years ago from him in a little pile. And this is Tony Daniel's Warpath. This caused quite a stir at the time. I think it's about 93. These are all books from the early 90s. When I was still active and I was reading Locus every month, and I was thinking no to that, whatever. Also at that time, I was building up my library of first, so I was buying more hardcovers, and I was buying things from dealers like Andy Richards at Cold Tonnage, and I was trying to sort of get to the best together. So I was spending less money on paperbacks, and I used to have less of a discount on books then at work with who I was working for. And you know, this is a war story. And it says rich and engrossing science fiction, heartfelt tale of lost love and friendship. This caused quite a splash, and this is a Millennium edition, so it's a UK one. It had a Millennium, of course, is Orion, which is basically became Golanx. And I remember the lady who used to be editor of Millennium. This was a new imprint then, and she said she chose the ant just to irritate everybody, which I thought was really funny. But then, of course, they did those dreadful Michael Moorcock editions with those terrible manga covers, which I hate. I know some of you like them, sorry. So, but yeah, this is supposed to be really good. I've read short fiction by him, which is okay, didn't blow me away. But that's Warpath by Tony Daniel, so I shall let you feast your eyes upon that little beauty there. There you go, quite nice looking, isn't it? This is a book I've shown once, I think, when I briefly talked about this writer way back in the early days of the channel, and this is Virtual Zen by Ray Nelson. Ray Nelson's first novel was The Ganymede Takeover, fairly routine alien invasion story which he wrote with Philip K. Dick, and he's most famous for the short story 8 o'clock in the morning, which was filmed as They Live by John Carpenter, and Virtual Zen. I mean, that's a typical cyberpunk title, it really is, and it's about a reggae star in the future. It's nice and slim. I'm sure that's going to be great fun. What a cover. Again, I bought that from my mate Graham a few years ago, and you can kind of tell with cyberpunk. Now, most of the late cyberpunk novels, and to me, after about 1986 is late cyberpunk, because I consider hardly anything to be real cyberpunk, in the same way that I think there's hardly any real steampunk, and all the real steampunk is before 1990. Forget the stuff that comes after. That's just Johnny come lately bandwagon jumping, really. You know, it's just people who think that wearing goggles on top of a hat is cool, and that's what it's about. Oh well, it's not really. It's about the recursive stuff and knowing your text and knowing about postmodernism and metafiction and what have you, and play in that sense. It's not really sort of like a goth subculture. That's what it's become. So, you know, anyway, before people start throwing things at the screen, imagine throwing things at your own phone, your own TV, whatever. It has happened. So yeah, but this sort of 2-word title, I do like a 2-word title where you mesh two things together. And Virtual Zen is obviously typically cyberpunk in that what it's doing is taking a hyper-modern word, virtual, and meshing it with something ancient, Zen. And of course, that's one of the reasons why a lot of cyberpunk narratives are set in Japan particularly, because of course Japan has fascinated us, because of course it was a feudal society with a godlike emperor until the end of the Second World War. Then the bomb dropped, you know, a real SF sort of scenario, dreadful thing, and then it was pushed into hyperdrive. You know, the pedal went to the metal, the buttons all got rammed down, American investment, and you know, it became this super modern place. And it's the clash between the modern and the ancient, which just so fascinates us about Japan. It's a wonderful culture. And you know, this was in the works of people like Yukio Mishima, who I really revere and have done since, you know, the end of the 70s. But you get this, you get things like Mark Laidlaw's Neon Lotus. You know, these are typical sort of cyberpunk titles. So this is late cyberpunk, really, but I'm sure that'll be great fun. Ray Nelson, jobbing author, but I reckon that's going to be really good time stuff. So we move on then to some more unfamiliar names, and this is William Barton's Transmigration of Souls, great title, and obviously one thinks of religious issues straight away. I'm going to put that down and talk a bit more about, and I'll come back to that, about the way things went in the 90s. And I talk with friends, and obviously, you know, I'm an old guy, and your perspective sort of changes and you see how things have developed. And I was certainly feeling that lack of freshness in SF there. Maybe it was just me. But the real point is this, is that you did notice that writers were starting to have shorter careers. Publishing was becoming more rapacious. And writers have very short careers now. If you look back at people from the golden age in the 1950s, 60s, 70s, these people kept on going. Now, obviously, science fiction was like an underground thing, really, until at least the 50s. Then it gradually exploded and became the dominant sort of genre mode in Western culture, in the mass media. So people had a lot of catching up to do. So this is why people are still reading things from the 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s. It's also because a lot of them are really, really good and are better than what's happening now, because science fiction is a modern genre. It's a modernist genre. It relies on an understanding of the post-industrial world, of the industrial world, in the way that came up, what's happened since. It requires a certain sort of thinking about the media landscape and technology. It really, really is something that fits and fitted the 20th century, and to a lesser degree, in my view, the 21st century, because we're now living in some of the futures that SF predicted, though of course more subtly and through a glass darkly. So there is all that to think about. With that as context, as publishing grew more demanding and more profit focused, sort of really editors and publishers, they gave fewer chances for writers to develop. You had to hit the ground running, because of course it's investments, a lot of money. Most books fail. It's the same way that most records fail. You know, you throw mud against a wall and you see what sticks. So a lot of writers would have 2 or 3 books and then stop. Writers from this period, some of them did 7 or 8 books, and then, you know, they either kept going because their sales were steady, or they declined and they ended up self-publishing with very small presses or what have you. And that happened to a lot of writers in the 90s. Once you get into the 21st century, now it's very much 3 strikes and you're out. You know, I know lots of writers I can think of who, you know, did 3 books and then that was it. And then since then they've had to go all the way of small presses. And if you look at a lot of the people from Britain, British SF authors from the late 80s, early 90s, and I'm thinking of people like Eric Brown, Paul Veerman's, Keith Brooks, sort of people like that. You know, they started with something like Gollancz, and they had 2 or 3 books out. And, you know, their books now mostly come from things like PS or from Newcon. You know, they're small presses. They're literally a few hundred copies. You can't make a living on that. So they're doing these things, and they're keeping the rovers going. They're keeping writing, which is great. And those small presses do a wonderful job of keeping them alive, because often they're very good artists. But, you know, they don't have the big deals anymore, and they don't keep getting the chances. So that happens a lot. And I think that's happened to a lot of the writers I'm going to read in this TBR. But anyway, going back to Transmigration of Souls, and this is set in a world where it seems quite prescient, and it just looks really, really good. And this guy, he'd been around for a while. I think his first books are in the 70s, so he was like quietly producing work. This is actually in the 101. So I have used this as a guide and bought some of these things as I've gone along with a view to catching up, because I do trust the judgment of these sort of guys. And basically, this is about a future America which has become like a fortress and shut out the rest of the world because it's still sort of, you know, successful and prosperous, and is concerned about sort of fundamentalism in religion and what have you. And it's got this issue because an alien artifact is discovered, and it can link itself to sort of anywhere in the known universe. And some astronauts from other cultures, Chinese, Arabs, they decide to sort of get involved with this as well. So it's a sort of clash of cultures things. So it's kind of prescient of some of the SF we've seen in recent years. This has become a common thread. There's lots of things in European SF and in some SF coming out of Africa about walls being built across the Mediterranean and things like that. And in Ken MacLeod's wonderful Corporation Wars trilogy, which is set quite far in the future, there are references to one character when he's young, you know, seeing drone footage of hundreds of skeletons on a beach on the far side of the Mediterranean. So, you know, it is focused that way. And because it's got sort of cross-cultural and religious issues, I'm really looking forward to reading this. I think it'll be fascinating. So that's William Barton, Transmigration of Souls. So I'm just going to pop that up on the podium so you can take a look at that as well while I burble on. There we go. And this is something you'll have seen in a book haul I did with my friend Graham recently. That's The Bones of Time by Kathleen Ann Goonan. I've read another book by her called In War Times, which is in the 101 science fiction there from DeFilippo and Broderick. And this is about a artifact from Hawaii. I think it's the bones of a king, yeah. And a young mathematician who worked out a way of using them to travel to alternate universes. There's more to it than that, but there you go. And I read In War Times by her, which was really well written. I enjoyed the writing was really, really good, and say it was in the reference book, but I did find it quite dull. It didn't really grab me, so I think I'll give her another go. There is another book by her called Queen City Jazz, which I think is quite acclaimed as well. And I really quite fancy that one. I'll see if I can pick a copy of that up, but I'm going to give that a try. It's quite chunky. We're into the late 90s now. This is about 96. And, you know, she does have to step up and impress me, so we shall see. And this is her first paperback, and it's Tor. But yeah, quite nice. Graham had a couple of these, actually, and obviously he's got a hardcover because he's got a bit of everything stashed away, as you'll have seen, if you look at the stunning SF collection and the revisitation we did recently, where Nick and I did book hauls. And then somebody he talked to me about, actually, and this again is in the DeFilippo and Broderick book, is Elizabeth Hand's Glimmering. Now hold on, let me just pop this up here as well so you can take a longer look at that too, as we're doing the double book thing. And this, as I say, had loads of acclaim, 1997, and it's a millennial novel, so it was set in 1999, so it's overtaken by events. And it was quite nice, that, doesn't it? It really does. And it's a chunky tome again. And Graham and I were talking a while ago, and he was saying to me, I read some of her the other day, and of course what Graham is, he's one of these people, he buy a load of books, and whereas I used to be more careful, I'd buy one and read it and then maybe go through the author's work. I'm less like that now. I'm more impulsive as I get older. Don't know what that means. And I have read stories by her. I can't remember much about them, but Graham was saying he read a collection of her stories and he thought it was absolutely brilliant. So I decided to give this a go, especially since Paul and Damien said it was really good. And what is it about? Let's see. It's 1999, The Last Days. It's about climate change coming a bit early, and it's about a millionaire publisher, jaded rock star, and the night of 1,000 years is coming up, and the millennium is strange, isn't it? It's the past. I work with people who were only just born when that happened, which is just really, really weird. It's got this strange die cut down the side there, which I really hate, that sort of design. I really can't stand it, and it's horrible. I never do a die cut on a paperback or a hardcover jacket. So that's Elizabeth Hand, Glimmering, and it's got a cover which makes it look a bit like a sort of horror novel. So we shall see about that. That'll be an interesting one. Popping it in there. Another one that's in the DeFilippo Broderick book is Bloom by Will McCarthy, who produced quite a few books, I think. And as soon as I read about this and read the back of it, I thought blood music. It's about late 21st century and this man-made organisms which can self-replicate called mycora, and they're very, very small, and they spread across the globe and they pretty much wipe out humanity. But there are some survivors out near the moons of Jupiter. And of course one naturally thinks of blood music, but Bloom is a good title. This is a UK one, Gollancz there, right at the end of the 90s, and a different cover in the USA, so I thought I'd give that a try. I'm not really big on hard SF. It is part of the reading you have to do if you're an SF fan. I'm not a massive sort of believer in it. So really with a lot of books like this for me, it's not as much about the concepts, because these guys often come up with great concepts. It's also how good the writing is as well. I want to see hard SF if it's really, really well written. And of course, people like Gregory Benford sort of broke the mold on that, so it's important for sort of any hard SF writer after the end of the 70s to really be somebody who can step up in a literary sense. So it's going to be interesting to try that, because this isn't the thing I'd normally kind of check out, but because I'm doing this TBR and this catch up for the 90s, I thought really I should get into that and give it a try. Finally, we will look at the last selection. There are other things as well from the 90s I want to read. I just probably haven't been able to get them out. You never see many B format books on this channel because my B formats are so inaccessible. At some point I've got to work out how to do a shelf tour of them so you can see them, because I've got lots of nice ones, but it's just a way of doing it because I have no shelf space. I am really looking forward to this because this is somebody who, gosh, I just haven't, he's been around for years and years and years, and I've read stuff edited by him, and I have read shorts again. There's loads of writers I've read short stories by just to try them out, and I used to be very, very picky, and I'm still quite picky, and I think that's the way to be because there's so much SF published. And this is George Zabrowski, whose career I think started about 73, and this is Cave of Stars from 1999, which looks great, doesn't it? A fantastic cover. And John W. Campbell Award, and it's character driven. It's quite short, so it'll be fleet and fast moving, which is great. And it's about Earth has gone, but there's a human-like society living in Tau Ceti, and it's about religion. They have like a new Vatican there and what have you. And I think this is going to be really, really interesting, and this is one of the ones I'm looking forward to the most. And duty reading. Do I feel the need to duty read? I used to duty read when I was young, and when I was discovering classics and stuff, and a lot of it was very, very invigorating, rewarding. Some of it wasn't. And maybe this is a certain amount of duty reading, but this is what I'm really looking forward to. So that's the 90s TBR. When I've read all or most of these, I'll come back and I'll do one, maybe two videos about them and do some little reviews for you and what have you. So that'll be next year probably. I'm going to work my way through these between now and the end of January, alongside some contemporary books, because I have some new things I want to read. You try and keep up a little bit, even though I generally think newer books are not as good as older ones. There are, of course, exceptions. I've got one thing I'm looking forward to. So this is Outlaw Bookseller with a little TBR. I'm signing out for now. Subscribe, like, comment, all that stuff. Super thanks is there. Thank you always for watching. Hope you enjoyed that. And, if you have anything to say about these, no spoilers, please. And, just let me know. Thanks, and bye for now.